because it's such a new position that we actually anticipate that aside from doing the plan reviews, which we know we're going to be doing, we're going to rely on you to help design this position for the future. And they weren't kidding. What I will tell you is my other role is what we call Life Safety Code Liaison. And up until 2016, the Life Safety Code plan reviewers and inspectors were under our roof at the State Health Department. Some legislation came along that changed that effective July 1st of 2013 and moved those folks over to the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control. So they're over in Lakewood at the Department of Public Safety with the State Patrol and CBI. We still have the responsibilities to CMS and the feds to provide those surveys and those plan reviews to make sure that certified facilities are meeting federal requirements. So we had to enter into an interagency agreement with Division of Fire Prevention and Control to continue to provide those services for us. So my other role, aside from doing FGI, is to also be that conduit that exists between the State Health Department and the Division of Fire Prevention and Control. So about every Monday, I spend about a half a day actually working at their office in Lakewood. So if you ever try to get a hold of me on Monday mornings and I'm not available, that's because I'm over on the other side of town playing with my fire buddies over there. So why are we here tonight? I was asked to come and give a little talk about the FGI and the process. Let me make sure I understand how to run this thing. I guess just the right arrow. Assisted living facilities. Now in Colorado, up until this last year, we were doing FGI plan reviews for several facilities. I tell you what, before I get into that, let me just follow the slides. That seems to be the logical thing to do. As mentioned earlier, I come out of the fire service background. Started as a volunteer firefighter in my hometown while I was going to college at Lamar Community College. That turned into a full-time gig, and in 1988 I became a full-time firefighter and an EMT, ultimately an EMT intermediate, which if you're familiar with that is just one little step below a paramedic. But that works well in the rural areas. So I worked up through the ranks in the fire service while riding also in the back of an ambulance quite often, and also took on the challenge of being a deputy coroner. That was interesting for 24 years until I left Lamar. And also ultimately, as I progressed up and became the chief at Lamar Fire and Ambulance Services, was appointed also as the emergency manager for the city of Lamar, Colorado. And then of course I did another 15 months over in Meeker, basically in the same regard. During that time, I got my bachelor's in fire science from Columbia Southern University, and after that, became an internationally accredited chief fire officer through the Center for Public Safety Excellence. So those are some credentials. That's what the CFO is. I also am a certified fire inspector. Although I don't do the inspections, I'm required to have that as part of my job at CDPHE. So I want to address the history of FGI plan review process in Colorado. Health facilities subject to FGI, which has changed a little bit in this last few months, aside from ALRs. FGI addition and considerations for the future, special situations to keep in mind, required documents for the plan review, the actual submission and review process, the regulatory waiver process, and some other helpful resources. So history of FGI in Colorado. The actual authority given to CDPHE is done through state legislation and state statute to basically establish rules, which is of course what the Board of Health does on our behalf. I won't get into the details on that because, to be honest with you, that's not my area of expertise. I've gone to the state capitol one time, and I don't really need to go back if I can avoid it. But the Colorado Board of Health does license individual chapters. 6 CCR 1011-1. 4 years ago, I didn't even know that existed. Now I have it memorized. Standards for each facility type. We are also mandated through statute to periodically update those rules, which is quite a challenge. It's quite a lengthy process, I've learned, and it certainly is a stakeholder process that our internal staff works with. But there are numerous licensure categories that we work with and have to periodically update. So FGI took effect for any construction initiated on systems installed on or after July 1st, 2013. However, there wasn't anybody to do it until they hired me. Actually, that's not true. They had a gentleman there before me that was there for 3 or 4 months, and I don't know why, but he wasn't there anymore. So prior to basically about the 1st of 2016, somewhere in that area, there were 3 years of requirements that facilities submit to FGI plan review, but the state health department had nobody to review them. My boss, Kara Johnson Hufford, and a few others were wearing multiple hats, and basically at that time were saying, okay, here's what we want you to do. Submit the plans, give us an attestation that you're meeting FGI, and we're going to call it good. Well, somewhere along the lines, I think the attestations really weren't being entirely forthcoming and honest, which is what brought about my position and that of that brief predecessor before me. So what we're following is the guideline for design and construction of healthcare. That is this book right here. This is the 2018 edition for residential. Now, all of our other facilities, and we'll get more into this in a little bit, use the 2010, but that's changing here in the next handful of months. So this is the document in question. Whether you love it, whether you hate it, this is the one. So we'll get more into that in just a bit. So FGI is currently required now in 13 unique chapters of 6 CCR 1011, and here is the list currently. Now, facilities like hospitals, nursing homes, hospices, freestanding emergency departments, ambulatory surgery centers, group homes for developmental disabilities have all been part of that since day one. However, we have added a few. Of course, as you guys know, the assisted living residences was added. We actually began that process, I think, before I was even hired. It was a multi-year process to update those rules in Chapter 7. And it culminated with the Board of Health adopting the rules in the spring, I think April of 2018. What we decided to do, and with everybody's assistance, including the stakeholder group that helped us work through all of this, was to give about a 14-month grace period for assisted living residences to kind of help prepare that process, to help answer questions, and made that effective for new licensure June 1st of last year, with an additional 6 months of grace period for any current licensed facility that needed to undergo some sort of renovations or additions. All of those dates have now come and gone, so now the AL world is basically functioning just like all the other ones that have been in the system for quite a while. We've added a few other with the changes that we did in Chapter 2, which are the general licensure chapter. We added a few other licensure categories, including acute treatment units. We have some other ones coming down the road with the legislation that's come about with behavioral health. That's still a few years coming. We're building those licensure categories as well. So this is the current list of 13 various licensure categories that FGI does apply to in one way or another. So some miscellaneous tidbits of information. The additions. We talked about that. 2010 edition is being utilized for everything but ALRs right now. And with the Board of Health adopting the updates to Chapter 2, that brought about the inclusion of the 2018 edition of FGI for everything effective July 1 of this year. So that same grace period kind of mentality that we had with the ALs, we've applied that now to all the other facility types as they're transitioning from 2010 to 2018. We avoided 2014. It was a bit of a mess, and it was not well received across the various AHJs in the nation. So we decided to forego that. The ALs were the first ones to undergo the 2018, primarily because we were already in the process of updating Chapter 7 while we were still working on the logistics going into the 2018 update for everybody. So it only made sense, rather than to put the Board of Health and the stakeholder groups through two different rule updates going from 2010 to 14 and then 14 to 18. We just made the huge jump. And our ultimate goal is from now on to basically update the FGI as it's updated at their level. So they do a revisions process, and they revise those FGI guidelines every 4 years. Michelle Pinkowski and I both serve on the HGRC committee. We'll talk a little bit more about that. That's currently in a 3-year process that's creating any of the revisions or edits for the 2022 edition of FGI. So it's great that Colorado finally has representation on that group. We'll talk a bit more about that as well here in a few. I guess we can talk about it now because it's right next on my list. So it's kind of odd having my screen behind me. I usually have a monitor in front of me. And that was too small for me to read. My eyes aren't that good. So FGI, again, is a nationwide nonprofit created and designed to help provide minimum standards for healthcare environments, residential living environments. Again, it's a minimum guideline, and nothing says that you can't go above and beyond that. It is recognized in one way or another, and I think the current number is 46 states. Not all of them, of course, are AL. They vary from state to state, whether it's acute care, hospital, outpatient, whatever. And then there are a few states that don't use FGI, but either are in the process of adopting it in one way or another, or using FGI guidelines to create their own state standards. So FGI does have a big role in this across the nation. I attended my first FGI HGRC meeting at the end of, in the spring of 2018 to learn the process, because Doug Erickson, who's the executive director of FGI, has become quite a mentor to me and also has been a tremendous support in our state, felt the need to try to get Colorado representation on that group. We've been using it since 2013, but we really didn't have a dog in the hunt because we didn't have any representation there. So they, FGI appointed me on what they call the Health Guidelines Revisions Committee, and I learned right away that it pretty much goes nonstop. I think there was about 8 or 9 months of break between when FGI finally approved the 2018 guidelines to be distributed and produced, and when they started the process for the revisions for the 2022 edition. And that's where Michelle and I got involved. We both got appointed to the residential guidelines group. It's been very interesting. I've learned a lot. I've also discovered that I have a lot more to learn. But I'm very thankful that Colorado finally has that representation on that group. The nice thing about FGI, at their level is that they include members on this group that are not only authorities having jurisdiction like me, but also association members for the various licensure types, administrative people. There's any number of folks who can participate on it. There's about 130, I think, nationwide that participate at the HGRC level, but not one of them is a vendor. They do not allow for somebody who may make equipment, medical equipment, anything like that, to serve on it. So it's all AHJs and representatives and from the associations and the various organizations that serve you folks. So I think that's great that they did that. It kind of helps to keep some of that conflict of interest out. So how do we access FGI? Well, the nice thing about it is when we use the 2010 edition, it's one book for everything: hospital, outpatient, residential. But it was a costly book, and quite frankly, most of it, if you're an AL or let's say a skilled nursing facility, obviously you didn't need the document that had hospitals and freestanding emergency departments and ambulatory surgery and all of that. So over time, FGI has broken that into 3 different volumes. So you have the hospital volume, you have the outpatient volume, and the one that I brought tonight is the residential volume. They dropped the price. It's still a $200 book, which is about what I was paying for, I think, my anatomy and physiology book in college back in the mid-'80s. I never could understand why a book costs that much. However, I understand with FGI because it is absolutely their sole source of income is book sales. As a result of that, we can provide a book if you come to our office. You don't have one, you want to look something up. We have books, and of course by statute we're required to provide those to the public to look at and view. on our campus. The one thing that we can't allow because of the copyright laws is photocopies or pictures of the book. You can write down all you want, but I can't let you take a picture or a photocopy of pages and take it off with you. FGI kind of frowns on that because, again, that is their source of income. The other way to do it is through an organization called MadCAD. Some of you who have talked to me have probably heard me talk about that. We use MadCAD. We actually have a subscription to it because it allows me to access the FGI requirements, or the documents rather, without having to carry a book around with me. Sometimes that's handy. MadCAD also, so I think it's $200 a year, I believe, for that as well. But MadCAD also has their free online access. If you just need to look something up, excuse me, you don't maybe have an architect that has it available to you, and you just want to get a little bit of an idea of what it's about, you can register with them for their free online access. It's on our webpage. Actually, I don't know if it is, but if not, get a hold of me, I can get it to you. And it will allow you 2 accesses per month to their free online page at 20 pages per access, so you get 40 pages a month. Now, I believe Chapter 4.1 in FGI, which pertains to ALs, itself is 18 pages. Now, it references back to a few other sections in that book. For example, the area where it talks about a functional program and things like that. But the main body of the Chapter 4.1 in this book, I believe, is 18 pages long. So theoretically, you can at least look at that in one setting and still have 22 pages left for your month. So if that's something you're interested in or need to have access to, and you can't find it, certainly give us a call, and we'll walk you through that process. Make sense? Okay. So here is your staff. As I mentioned earlier, up until about a year and a half ago, I guess about 15, 16 months ago, it was me, just the top guy in the red there, for the entire state of Colorado, for every licensure type, and that included hospitals and all of that. We were talking earlier about how much of a challenge it can be when UC Health is building a 14-story tower on the Anschutz campus, which they're starting right now. That plan review alone for that one project is 2 months. So when it was me, I had to do, for lack of better words, triage. I'd get all these projects in, and I knew that, for example, UC Health was building a new hospital in Highlands Ranch. They were building a new hospital in Greeley. They were both 7 or 8-story hospitals, and they were going to be multi-year projects. So it kept getting bumped because I could not set everything else aside for half a year, or actually for the 3 projects that we were working on with UC Health was a third of the year. I couldn't set all those aside to do those 3 hospitals, so I kept bouncing them back in the queue, knowing that someday we were going to have to pay the piper, right? So that's where this guy in the middle came in. He paid the piper for me. My background is in codes. I'm not an architect. And so when they hired me, it was because of my experience in the fire service with the International Fire and Building Codes. I did do a lot of that back home in Lamar. So I have the codes background. About 15 months ago in November of 2018, we brought Thomas Jackson on. He likes to be called Ash. I think it has something to do with his middle name. Lately he's been pretty sick, so that's kind of been the color of his face. But I'm glad to see him back in the office today. We were afraid he might have had pneumonia, so for about a week he's been pretty ill. But he's vertical still and looking at the grass from the colorful side, so I think we're going to get him through this ordeal. Ash has a background in architecture. He has a master's degree, and he's a licensed architect in both Colorado and Texas, which is where he came from. We threw Ash into the whole mix of things right away by putting him on those 2 UC Health projects. So immediately after getting his onboarding done, he did a few small plan reviews in order to understand the process, and then he went head first right into Highlands Ranch and Greeley. It was important because these 2 projects were both UC Health projects. We had all the same people in contact with us, the same project folks, and it was very important that, from our perspective, that those 2 plan reviews were consistent, because we knew if I reviewed one as a codes person and Ash reviewed one as an architect, we were going to get 2 different products. Not huge differences, but enough to where we felt it was best to commit him to that and do both of those reviews, while I continued to do the smaller ones. So that turned out pretty well for us. But we continue to grow. Heaven knows that Colorado has all kinds of growth going on, and that includes the healthcare system. It's growing by leaps and bounds. So after about a year of doing it with Ash on board with me, we needed another person, and got the legislature to fund that position. So we've now grown, we've tripled our size in a little under 3 years, or under 4 years rather. We added Regina Lopolato on board. The neat thing about Regina is she brings both Ash's background and my background into the team. She was a plan reviewer, certified plans examiner, all of that kind of stuff in Adams County at Brighton, and she is also a licensed architect in Colorado. So I'm very proud of where we've brought this program, and we're finally getting the resources that we really needed in order to make it work. Any questions on that? So we talked about the volumes. I'll just blow past that. With the ALs in mind, one of the issues that came up, well, let me back up. When the Board of Health adopted the Chapter 7 revisions back in the spring of 2018, we had lengthy discussions with stakeholder groups that included AL owners and various folks who in one way or another are involved in the AL industry, many of which I didn't know, but I've come to learn over time. And what that group did was made some recommendations on things that they just felt were not appropriate for small ALRs. We understand. We know what you're up against, believe it or not, even though we're the state. We do understand what you're up against, and we know that when you're buying a private residence, there are some limitations. You're on a budget, like anybody is. It's probably a somewhat smaller budget than UC Health would have with the Anschutz 14-story tower, but it's still a budget. And our goal and objective is not to run you out of business, but at the same time, we have to serve as those protectors of the users of all healthcare systems in Colorado. But we certainly want and are required to utilize stakeholder input when we're creating or amending these rules. So the stakeholder group said, the concerns that we have with FGI that we just don't figure we can live with involve a couple of issues with the small ALRs. The first one being the requirement in FGI that says that the resident has to be able to access a bathroom or a toilet room without entering a corridor. Does that sound familiar to anybody? It does to me. I've been hearing it for a while now and trying to figure out how to process that. So the discussion came up that really begged us to find out what the definition was of a corridor. FGI has a glossary, and it's great. It has some wonderful information, but for whatever reason, there's nothing in that book that says what a corridor is. So we wrote a formal request, and Michelle Pinkowski was involved with this as well, to FGI saying, here's our concerns, here's our thoughts, and what by chance do you think a corridor is? It was determined that a corridor, and FGI made this determination in agreement with what we were suggesting, that a corridor is a public corridor. Okay, so I don't know what the terminology is for a larger ALR. I would tend to call it more of an institutional design, kind of like what you might see in a nursing home where you have this long corridor, and you've got resident rooms and maybe soiled and clean linen and different things, scattered down this corridor. You need to walk by me? Yeah. Please go ahead. That to me does not really fit the design of a residential unit, a residential home in a residential neighborhood. FGI agrees. So basically, when we're talking small ALRs, they are exempt from that requirement. Now, typically we're thinking a small ALR is 10 or fewer beds in that area, but FGI said it may go upwards of 15. So the point being is that in this case, it hinges less on the number of beds and more on what the design of the building actually is. You may have a residential home that handles 15 residents, I don't know. If so, then it's going to be exempt from this. But in our rules, it actually says 10. That'll be changed because based on the feedback we got and the interpretation we got back from FGI. So rather than saying, okay, if you have a 14-bed ALR, it may be a home, but because it's more than 10, it has to meet this requirement. You have to be able to access bathrooms without entering a corridor. That's not the case. If it's a residential home by design, then it doesn't have the public corridors by definition, and that you will be exempt from that. Yes, ma'am.
So do you have to do a waiver?
Not for that, no. No. Now, if you're at the 16 or more, then that becomes a little bit more complicated. First of all, it's kind of, I don't know how common it is to see 16 residents in a residential home in a neighborhood. It may be possible, but 16 is the cutoff that FGI recognizes as a larger ALR. So you may need a waiver for that. I'm not positive. But,
what was the question? Sorry.
what is the possibility of having, she asked about a waiver. Is there a need for a waiver over 10 to avoid that accessing the bathroom without entering a corridor? And the answer is no until we hit 16, and then it's possible. But again, we're basing that typically on the actual design of the building and not a bed count. But that 16 is going to be a factor there. I'm just not sure what it's going to be yet because we have yet to encounter that. Nobody's had to apply for that yet.
So, along that line, let's say somebody were to find a home and it's 15 and they say, okay, I would like to buy that and turn it into the assisted living home. That's not a given, as you said, that it would be approved. So therefore, what would be the best course of action? Would it be just to get a plan of the layout of that building and send to the FGI link?
I'm not entirely following you. Try it again.
Okay, so let's say someone were to find a 15-bed home, right?
So they're looking to buy one to start an ALR.
Or they want to put 15 bed in a home,
Uh-huh.
15, bed, 15 residents in a home with 15 bed. And they wanted to make sure that this would be pretty much approved. The next course of action, would it be to just go ahead and get a layout of the building and send it to you guys?
Great question. Yeah, so we certainly understand that you don't want to make an investment in a property if it's not going to either meet your needs or meet our requirements. That makes sense. So we're very receptive to having those meetings. If you've got a property and you can get your hands on some kind of a drawing, then probably what we will do is ask you to submit that to us. We'll have a look, and it may require a follow-up meeting that involves our programmatic staff as well. So I'm looking at it from an FGI standpoint, but there could be some other issues from a licensure standpoint that is not my area of expertise. So what we can do is we can get everybody together, our survey branch people and us and you, and say, is this going to work? And what's been really cool, I think, about my time at the State Health Department is they will find any way they can to try to make it work for you. If they can't, it's because it simply doesn't exist. They're really great about bending over backwards to say, okay, can we do this? Can we do that? What about a regulatory waiver for this? Again, we recognize that this is a service that's needed. The last thing that we want to do is be the ones trying to hinder you or shut you down.
And of course, that would exclude the grandfathered facilities, right? That were,
Right,
Yeah.
right. So yeah, we can
So that
talk
would
about
include
grandfathering a
facilities.
little bit. Certainly, if you were already in existence before FGI, you don't have to comply with FGI. The only time you will is when you're doing a renovation or addition to the existing licensed facility, but only the area within the scope of that renovation will have to comply with FGI. You do not have to bring the whole building up to compliance. But if you're doing, let's say you're doing an addition, some folks will consider maybe taking an existing garage and turning it into 2 more resident rooms. Those 2 resident rooms would have to comply with this book, not everything else. Okay, you're gonna, yeah, go ahead, and then we got somebody back here.
2 quick questions to follow up on that. If we came to you with a set of drawings for a 15-bed like he's discussing, how quickly could you do that initial review?
Well, okay, we'll talk about the queue. I'll get to that in just a minute because it's in my slide presentation, if that works for you.
That was part of the question, yes.
Okay.
And then on the grandfathering, does a license change require upgrades? to
Okay,
FGI?
great question. So if you're selling your business and you have a new owner, there is no requirement to comply with FGI as long as there was never a lapse in licensure. If you have that license go right up to the day that the new owner takes over, it just continues. If there's a lapse in licensure and for whatever reason that license expires, and then a new owner comes in and wants to use that, then yes, it would have to comply. Okay. I think somebody back here, if you want to hand the microphone in that direction.
My question was the timeline.
Was what?
The timeline.
The queue time?
Process, the one he asked.
Okay, okay. Well, we'll continue then. We'll get to that. It is in here. So that's one of the examples of what the Board of Health took out of FGI in regards to small ALRs. The other one is the requirement for an elevator in a multi-story. It's still a requirement for the larger ones. And I'll tell you, after being an EMT for several years, I can tell you that if you've got a patient on a high, on a raised floor or down in a basement that's in respiratory arrest, heaven forbid cardiac arrest, and they're a full code, it is impossible to provide care to that patient while you're moving them up and down stairs. Secondly, it's unsafe for everybody. So that was the logic and the rationale for FGI putting that in. But we certainly understand the limitations that creates for a residential design home. Board of Health agreed, it's not in there for these small ALRs. And finally is the parking requirements. FGI has parking requirements. We've taken that out and said basically we're leaving it to the locals for whatever their adopted parking ordinances are.
Marshall, on the elevators, when you say small, are we still talking about 15 and under that wouldn't require the elevator?
You know, right now it's written as 10 or under,
Right.
but I do know that there's some of these elements are going to be readdressed by the Board of Health down the road, not too far. And it won't surprise me if it doesn't kind of follow along the lines of the public corridor thing, that 15. But don't quote me on that because we're talking about two different items there. We're talking about that definition of corridor versus public corridor. It wouldn't surprise me, and again, please don't quote me on this. I don't want to be up in the executive director's office. But it wouldn't surprise me if we don't follow along the same thought process that we have with the corridors and basing it more on a building design rather than a number of beds.
So what would you think of a walkout basement? Would you consider that they would be most likely not required to have an elevator because you could take them out?
I think
to the
so.
basement?
I would believe so. I'll tell you that we've run into an issue just recently with an AL here in the metro area that has a fully renovated basement. It's very nice, but the only way out for the secondary means of egress is through the window well. Nothing prohibits that. I have some concerns about it. It's probably the firefighter in me, but I'm trying to envision what it would be like for a 75-year-old person to climb up on a dresser to try to go out a window well and then be in a window well and have to get out of that. From a firefighting standpoint, that's one of the worst nightmares that I could envision if I'm rolling in on a structure fire is, first of all, doing search and rescue and finding these patients or these residents, but also how are we going to get them out and actually having to commit resources to doing rescue rather than suppression activities. So there are some challenges there, but if it's a walkout, it is a little bit of a different story. And in that case, it's more of a life safety code issue than an FGI issue, but I know they certainly smile on walkout sort of basement designs.
Terrific, thank you.
Sure. Back here. And I don't know if they want to hold questions till the end, or if they're pertaining to what we're talking about here, that's fine. Whatever you want to do. I'm here all night.
Would that be similar to like garden level windows? They're like 6 feet across and...
You talking about the AL in question that I'm...
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I know that in the designs, they had to crawl up. It was probably about, I'm guessing maybe 3 feet off the floor. I'm trying to remember now. But again, that's quite a challenge if you're 75 years old and limited a little bit in your mobility. Now, our recommendation to them would be that they don't put those people down there that have those limitations. But still, even if you don't have the limitations, I'm 54 years old next month. I don't know that I could climb out that anymore. I'm getting old way before my time. But yeah, those would be that garden level sort of design. We just have concerns about somebody, an elderly person, crawling up on furniture to get out. but we don't really have anything to hang our hat on. We relied on the locals, the local fire department and the local building code, because it was a private pay only, it wasn't CMS certified. And they said, look, they meet the code, they're good. So we're okay with that, but we caution them to at least try to be cognizant of who they're putting down there. We don't want any fatalities in that environment. Was there one more question before I continue?
How about you, like, in the basement? In the basement that doesn't have the walkout entrance and exit, how about if you put a door leading down to, dig it from somewhere else, from outside, and have them walk down and up and down through, with stairs, would that be okay, or?
I'm going to shy away from that question, because what you're talking about is actually more a life safety code question and not FGI. If you're talking about a federally certified facility, then it will be life safety code. If you're talking about a private pay, then we would have to look at whatever local ordinances, because that's the way this works. Life safety code applies to federally certified, not state licensed. However, there are some communities, I'll give you an example. This is where things get a little wonky. So if you have a private pay ALR, let's say in Aurora, it's not certified, it's private pay, it's not an ACF. Because it's located in Aurora, and because Aurora is large enough to have its own certified fire inspectors and plans examiners and all that, then that plan review will be done by the folks in Aurora, and it will to whatever adopted code that Aurora has. If you scoop that whole ALR up, if you scooped up its staff, its residents, its policies and procedures, everything, and you parked it in Lyman, Colorado, it would be reviewed to the life safety code, because Lyman does not have certified fire inspectors. It's an all volunteer department. So location has a lot to do with that. And then in that case, fire prevention and control over in Lakewood would have to review that to the life safety code. Totally different sort of standards. But in your case, certainly it would either be life safety code or the locally adopted codes, and not an FGI question. Yes, sir.
How much influence do you have in those situations where Aurora is making the decisions? Do you have any influence on their decision making at all?
No, we don't. We simply contact them to ask them if this design is okay with you. And in this case, this recent one, they said, we understand your concern. The fire department didn't like it, I'll tell you that much. But their building official that did the plan review said, I believe it was an R4 occupancy, and ALRs are allowed to meet that requirement. He said, I understand your concern. He said, but that's what it's designed to, and it meets that requirement. So then we didn't have anything to hang our hat on with our concerns, other than to just say, think about who you're putting down there at least. That's really where our relationship ended in that. But we did reach out to them to see if they were okay with it. Make sense? Okay. Well, we'll continue. Another thing that's important to note, we're down at the bottom here in the green writing. FGI, if you're familiar with it at all, it'll have the main body of the text, and then at various pages or areas on the pages, it'll have, on the 2010, it's grayed area at the bottom. In the 2018, it'll have a code number or a guideline number with an A in front of it. When you see that, that's appendix material, and that is not enforceable. So you don't have to, when you're looking at the book and you're thinking about designing your ALR, or you're trying to figure out whether this property is going to meet our requirements, if you're looking at text that has a guideline number with an A in front of it, it doesn't apply. It's good practice. That's basically what it is. It's kind of the difference between should and shall. Everything else that we enforce is the should or the shall. That is the should. That's just to make it a little bit better, but it's not enforceable, and we will not take that into consideration when we're doing plan review. Just so you know. So we talked about this, the three exemptions that pertain to small ALRs. So, as most of you probably know, every licensed healthcare facility in the state of Colorado is required to comply with 2 chapters in our licensing rules. The individual licensing chapter, which for ALRs is what? There you go, chapter 7, and then chapter 2. All of them have to comply with chapter 2. That's the general license requirements. So what we did is we spent almost as much time, not quite, but almost as much time working on the chapter 2 rewrite as we do the chapter 7. It took us about a little over a year, I think, to get that rewritten. And what we wanted to do is clean up several sections of chapter 2, but we also wanted to migrate FGI into chapter 2 and out of those individual licensed chapters. We had to leave them in those individual licensed chapters before because not all facilities applied. Okay, so for example, hospitals is chapter 4. FGI was called out in chapter 4 as it was the various other licensure chapters at that time. Once we brought ALRs on, once we brought the acute treatment units on, and those other ones that were still hanging out there and getting missed in the process, then it allowed us to do some cleanup and housekeeping and take it out of all those various, I think 13 different licensure chapters and put it in chapter 2. What that does is make it much cleaner. It also makes it much easier, so when the time comes that we need to update to the chapter, or the 2022 edition, we simply only have to update one chapter instead of 13. Okay. The other thing that we did in chapter 2 was establish some definitions for FGI and some timelines also, and I think we'll talk more about that in a moment. But what this is saying right here at the bottom is that if we have those exemptions, like we're talking about with chapter 7 with the corridors, the elevators, and the parking, although FGI is called out in chapter 2 now, those exemptions will be identified in each of those individual chapters. Because we may have some exemptions like this for chapter 7, we may have exemptions for a C-arm or something like that for freestanding EDs in another chapter. That's where those exemptions will be called out when the Board of Health recognizes those, just so you know. So again, as I said, there's some definitions created in there for FGI. There's also that in chapter 3, or that general building and fire safety provisions. It's actually section 3 and not chapter 3. That's a little bit confusing. My apologies for that. We're still talking about chapter 2, general licensure chapter. So the physical plant standards are now identified in chapter 2 instead of those various licensure chapters. We now have what's called a guideline compliance review. We actually generated a term for that, which is the FGI plan review. Documents to be submitted for FGI review at the same time that local building permits are applied for. This is something new. Although we had FGI since 2013, the one thing that we didn't do is have any sort of rules that said when you needed to submit to us. All we could tell you was that you would not get your license until you've undergone plan review and subsequent approval. So we cautioned people, but we had nothing to hang our hat on there as well. And I'll give you a worst case scenario that happened that really drove this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Joe Tansey of our skilled nursing facilities branch. She oversees the nursing home licensing and the health surveys and all that. She runs into a nursing home administrator at a trade conference, and that lady said, "Hey Joe, have you heard we've got a new nursing home? It's about ready to go online." Joe said, "That's pretty exciting. Did you get your plan review done?" And that lady said, "What are you talking about?" So the plan review, it talks about that in our various documents, our licensing documents. But somehow that slipped through the cracks. So what happened in this scenario is it's a corporation that owns several nursing homes. They built a new nursing home in 2009 in another part of the state, and they wanted to build a nursing home in the San Luis Valley. They found a general contractor. They handed those pre-designed architectural drawings to that guy and said, "Build it." He built it. This was in 2000. I think they started construction in 2016. We found out about it in 2017. So what happened between 2009 and 2016? FGI. And they were about 65% built. They had the building built, they had all the foundation in, the floors, the plumbing, and they were putting up the studs and putting in drywall when they finally submitted to me for plan review. they did not meet FGI's requirements for the ratio of residents to bathrooms. So the jackhammers came out, they chiseled out concrete, they redesigned it, they redid the plumbing for the bathrooms. A tragic oversight, but they didn't do anything wrong other than not reading their application that talked about FGI. So what we want to do is try to avoid those situations. So we decided there needs to be something in rule that says when you submit to us. So basically, we felt that the simplest way of doing that was saying, when you have to submit to your locals, if you're getting a permit for locals for inspection or building or whatever, you should be submitting to us at the same time. There are places in the state that actually don't have locals and that do these permits for local building codes. So in that case, it just says that before you begin construction, you submit your plans to us. Okay?
Marshall, I got a question.
Yes, sir. Good, I need to take a drink.
So it seems to me that best practice would be to submit before you submit to the locals to make sure that you're meeting everything. Otherwise, you gotta go back and redo your permit.
Great question. Yeah, so we always recommend sooner rather than later. The one thing that we want to try to avoid, because we just don't have the time, and we still, even though we've tripled our staff, it's still a busy job, is we want to try to avoid a situation where we're doing a plan review more than one time. So we don't have to have your 100% drawings, but as long as we have a drawing that is very close, that you're comfortable with, if we encounter problems or later on you end up saying, I need to make this change, excuse me, we can work with that. What we want to try to avoid is having a preliminary set of drawings that we go through and do the plan review on, and then you kind of erase that and start over. That creates a problem for us. But certainly earlier rather than later is better. And then if we need to, we can have those pre-construction meetings. We do it quite often with architects, but nothing says that we have to have an architect there. You just come and present your plans to us. We ask for those in advance, along with any questions that you may have, just so we can do the research and be able to provide you a better answer when that meeting comes. But if any questions come up during those meetings, we're happy to work through those with you, both on the FGI side and the programmatic side. So we can bring in our licensing people, we can bring in Cheryl McMahon's team, Dee, Rita, any of these folks can come into that meeting as well and answer your questions, both from programmatic, licensing, FGI, everything. We can do that all at one time.
So who's the best person to create that FGI plan for your review? Would it be your architect?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what we require for everybody else, and then we can talk about the AL world. When we're doing a plan review, we basically require stamped documents from an architect because we need to be looking at, and we're talking hospitals and all of that, we need to be looking at STC ratings or sound ratings in walls. We're looking at all kinds of things. And certainly we recognize that when it came to the ALs, especially the small ones, now with the larger ALs, we're still going to require those. But in a small AL where you're considering buying a house that already exists, it may be kind of difficult to find architectural drawings. So in that case, we're not going to require the stamped architectural drawings like we would for other facility types, just because of the size of this building and the fact that it's probably being bought already constructed. What we're going to need is a set of drawings that are dimensioned in some way or other so that we can pull a dimension off of them. So I can look at a corridor width or something like that. As long as I've got one dimension, maybe a door width, if I know that this door is 36 inches wide, I can build my plan review off of that by scaling everything. Whereas with regular scaled architectural drawings, I put them into the program, I set the scale that it says at the bottom, and I'm ready to go to town and take my measurements. So we're able to do a little bit of flexibility with AL simply because of your size on your small ones, and help in any way we can. We really need to, we kind of joke about, we don't want plans that are drawn on the back of a napkin or a coaster. We kind of joke about that, but it's really true. We need some sort of drawing. They don't have to be stamped architectural drawings, but if we can pull some dimensions off of them and do the plan review, that will be good enough for us.
So my next question may be answered in your following slides, but are there specific key areas of concern that you're looking at?
Not really. Actually, when you look at all the various facility types that we review, I really do believe that the ALs will probably be among the simplest. For example, in hospitals, we have to take clear floor area measurements on practically every room where there's a patient. It's got to be this much clear floor area. You've got to have clearances between beds and fixed objects, all of that. That doesn't apply to ALRs. The only requirements that it says, for example, in a resident room in an ALR, is that you have to be able to access, it says you have to have a bed, a nightstand, 2 chairs, like a recliner, and then just another chair, a dresser. It has to be large enough to where you have clearances for people that have mobility devices, whether it's walkers or wheelchairs, and then you have to be able to give that resident an option for how they want to lay that room out. Maybe they don't want their bed in this corner, maybe they want it, over here some way. And as long as there's more than one way to organize that room to meet the resident's needs, that's all it really says. It doesn't give a minimum square footage of clear floor area like it does in some other facility types. Those are probably the areas that we look at the most. I'll tell you that, and Vern, as you and I talked before the presentation, I don't know how I'm doing on time, I'm getting close, about my hour. I've gotten a lot of phone calls since the Board of Health adopted that rule, and even more so as we got past the June 1st date that we had last year for new licenses, and moving towards the December 1st date that we had for renovations or additions to existing. Folks started calling us. And what I liked was that, in a common theme I was hearing is, I just decided to call and get the word from the horse's mouth because I've heard all kinds of rumors. And we've heard that for almost 2 years now. One of them was, I know that if I got to put a new roof on my house, I've got to meet all the FGI requirements. Not true. I've heard the rumor that, well, I've now got to have a commercial kitchen. Not true, at least not on the smalls. So those are just a couple of examples, but I've really been thankful for those folks who actually have called us to say, well, what's the story? I'm hearing this and it sounds like a nightmare. And then when they hang up, they're like, oh, that's not as bad as I thought it would be. But as far as the plan reviews that we've done so far, I think probably the biggest issue has been making sure that the rooms are large enough to where a resident can move around in there. You can rearrange the furniture a little bit to their liking so they feel more comfortable and that is their home. I think that's the biggest issue we've seen.
Quickly, since you just noted this, I thought there was some type of measurement guideline regarding 100 square feet for single rooms and 120 for, not an FGI though. It's been around.
Oh, there
for a
may
long
be in
time.
our licensing rule. Yeah, in chapter 7.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, there could be, but I'm just talking FGI.
yeah.
So, but your question does bring up a good point, and that's this last section right here. When various rules conflict, CMS and then the Colorado licensing rules will supersede FGI in that order. So FGI is the go-to. What we're trying to do right now, so you know, is we're trying to clean up various licensor chapters, and the one we're working on right now is the hospital chapter. So because we have FGI, what we're trying to do is go in and do a crosswalk between FGI and the licensing rules, and anytime there's a physical space requirement in there, we're trying to get it out of the rules because we've already got it here. And there are some out there that are in conflict. And when that happens, the Colorado licensing rule will supersede this. When it's a federally certified facility, if a CMS rule is in conflict, then it will supersede all of it, and you don't need waivers for that. Okay? So we'll try to be brief here. Of course, there are other documents that come along with FGI, and they need to be part of your business practice anyway, as you're planning on either building a new ALR or buying a property to convert to an ALR. And the one that we talk about the most is the functional program. FGI actually, in 1.2-2, describes what needs to be in that. I get people calling me all the time saying, do you have a template? No, I don't have a template. I've got some very good ones that I've seen that if I can get permission from those people, I can share it. But the reason there's no template for these documents is because FGI specifically has designed it to where it's something that should be unique and specific to your facility. So it's a little hard to apply a template that somebody else has created and make it fit your needs. But these are the various areas. Again, I'm kind of cutting it a bit short because we're about out of time. But certainly the functional program needs to come along with that. And these are some of the elements that are just important that for us to know about. From the plan review standpoint, it's also used with our health survey teams as well. But more importantly, it's for you folks to design your business. So that's what that's all about there. Resident safety risk assessment, infection control, resident mobility and transfer risk, fall prevention, med errors. Some of these have been added to FGI that weren't in the 2010, just because there's a tremendous amount of difference between over 8 years and how things are done. And so again, it's not that we're using it for plan review, but what we're really looking at is not only from the FGI side, but also from our health survey team side and licensing, is that you put the thought into making sure that these are addressed. And it's all has to do with that quality of life for your residents. Okay. Site plans, typically we will get these from an architect. This is the outdoor property. Where the grass is, where the parking is, signage and wayfinding, lighting, things like that. Obviously, it's going to be much more important on a large facility that probably has a parking lot and lighting and all of that than it would be a residential home. So again, much like we are with our architectural drawings or our structural drawings, we don't need anything real fancy. Because first of all, we're not looking at your parking. You may be small enough that there's not even any wayfinding, there's no signs. But we still need to be able to look at that property and have an understanding of how it's positioned on the property. Our survey team may be asking us from the FGI side, okay, what about slopes? The yard, are there obstacles in the yard? I know that they have some concerns about that. That may not necessarily be an FGI issue, but it's still information that our survey team may need to know about, especially if they're doing an initial licensure survey. What can we expect? So that's what that's for. Again, it doesn't have to be anything special. I've even had them received as a picture from Google Earth.
So I have another question for you. We can get an architect to do the site plans. Is there a professional out there that you know of that would do the risk assessment plan or the plan that was on the previous slide?
Pat comes to mind. I know I've worked with her on a few. I know she's worked on some projects that we've been involved with. I think there are some folks out there, and Pat, I'll let you address that maybe at a later time because of our time, but yeah, there are some resources out there. And we're willing to help any way we can. We can explain how this is, but again, it needs to be in your words what you're doing, because we don't know your business. This is your business, your property, and nobody would know better on how you're going to address these issues but you. Okay? Where are we? So, equipment, FGI talks about it. It's not a huge issue to us. And bear in mind, when we're talking about these various documents, we're not talking about any set way. When we're talking about the infection control risk assessment or the resident safety risk assessment, we may get it in a format that's nothing more than paragraphs. Sometimes folks put out a really nice spreadsheet with all kinds of colors and everything that gives check marks of how they address it. We don't care how it comes. We're just asking you to demonstrate that you put this thought process into your design when you were building your business plan, if you would. Okay. As far as equipment, with the ALRs, we're not near as particular about that as we are with a hospital. With a hospital, we need to know what kind of equipment there is, whether we're talking medical equipment, whether we're talking furniture, because again, in the case of the hospitals, we do have a square footage requirement. So if we're throwing in a bed and a nightstand and a dresser of some sort, or whatever they call those, now that starts encroaching on those square footage areas, and because of that, we need to know what kind of equipment's going in there in furniture. We may not always know just by looking at the plans, so that's what that list is for. For an ALR, it'd probably be nice for the equipment just to know what kind of furniture is going in there and basically what sizes. Mainly because we still, even though we don't have a square footage requirement, at least in FGI, we still need to be able to determine that what is in there is not going to hinder somebody that may have a mobility aid like a wheelchair or a walker. Did I see a hand up earlier?
So it seems
seems like there's some crossover between the policies and procedures that we are expected to provide to the health department and what FGI expects. So when the health department is already looking at, for example, the resident fall risk and prevention, people who are coming in and building homes would have no idea what a policy like that would look like. So it seems like there's some expectations at FGI that really extend beyond the Facility Guidelines Institute and into the policies and procedures of CDPHE.
That's true. It would appear that way. Bear in mind that these documents that you see are not only used for FGI, but they're used by our survey branches, and they're also used by fire prevention and control if they're doing a life safety code review. At very least, the functional program is. So there are some elements there. What I tell folks is that you probably already have this in one form or another in some written policy. It may just need to be cut and pasted and thrown into, maybe it's a different term. But again, what we need the most is the functional program, because it tells us what you're going to be doing in this space. The other area I'll tell you that is a concern to us is what we call the, where is it? I'll be honest with you, I don't care about emergency preparedness. I know that that's done in our survey branches. Why FGI put it in there, I don't know, but they did. I'm not going to ding you on that. But infection control risk, when we're talking about that, what that document really is when you're doing renovations or additions to a currently occupied facility, then there needs to be an assessment done before that occurs to say, okay, these elements of the construction process are going to possibly create an infection risk threat to our residents. These are the steps we're going to take to mitigate it.
So the resident safety risk assessment would be a remodel of an existing.
That's what we use it for on the FGI side. And we still need to assess this internally. This whole ALR thing's new to us, and certainly this book is new to us as well. We're all working from the same sheet here. I don't see a need for why I need a medication error risk to do an FGI review, I'll be honest. But if you've got it,
I would agree.
if you've got it, I guess throw it in, because we also provide that to our survey branches as well. Now, whether or not you provide it to them in another document, I don't know. But this is the sort of information we're still trying to work through. Okay? We're certainly not going to gig you that hard on this. The biggest thing I worry about is the infection control risk. And we had what was called a patient safety risk assessment. They now call it resident safety risk assessment. And what that is also in construction. If you're building a new building, I don't even need that. But if you're doing renovations or additions, again, I need to know that you guys met with your architect or your general contractor or whomever, and you've determined that these risks are what we can anticipate experiencing with our residents. That being dust, vibration, noise, maybe trip and fall from electric cords, and these are the steps that we took to mitigate that, so we've minimized that risk to our residents. If it's a brand new building, there's no residents to encounter risk. But
So can you speak to the infection control risk that you have to be preventative when you're trying to build a building?
some of them cross over with the resident safety risk assessment in that, I think of dust. You might have some patients that are COPDers, something like that, emphysema, that dust actually creates an infection control issue with them. And then you just identify these are the steps we took. Maybe you planned on taking them on a day trip that day and getting them out of the building when there's going to be dust or whatever. That's what we're asking for. It's very rudimentary. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we do need to be able to verify that the thought went into how are we going to protect these folks when there's construction going on.
How about for a new build that doesn't already have residents in it?
So the other element of an infection control risk assessment that probably tends to pertain more to hospitals and outpatient surgery centers and things like this is that it is also used as a multidisciplinary tool for you to say, okay, FGI says, for example, I have to have this many hand washing stations. But because of the clientele that we have, and this may not even apply to ALRs, but this is what it's used for as well. Because of the clientele we have, we need more hand washing stations. or the FGI says that I've got to have one airborne isolation room in my hospital, but because we have a tendency of getting more of those people here, our infection control risk assessment says we're going to put in 3. To be honest with you, I can't think of an example of when an ICRA would really create an issue for you in an ALR unless it's a renovation. If it's new, it's probably not going to be even a consideration. Okay? And then, of course, the floor plans, we've talked about that. So, trying to move along quickly here. Our process flow, we've intentionally made it simple. My good friends over at Fire Prevention and Control, you have to contact them, you have to apply for a permit, and go through a rather lengthy process with them. I'm not one for bureaucracy. I've worked for the government my whole life, but never at this level. It's been at the local level. And it drives me nuts when bureaucrats like myself make the process more complicated. So what we've done in our group is we've said, let's keep it simple. You need to have a plan review done? Send me a message, call me. There's no permit that has to be completed. We do have a new address now, an email address. It's fgireview@state.co.us, because there's now 3 of us watching for it. If I go on vacation and you send me an email with your plans and it sits there for 2 weeks, that's not good. It's not good for you folks to wait. It's bad for PR for us. So now we've created this email that any one of the 3 of us will see at any given time and respond to in a timely manner. Send your request to us, call us, we'll talk you through the process. Once we receive your documents by email, we don't have room. Of course, we're trying to go paperless. We do believe in that. So we don't want hard copies. Send it to us in an email and PDF format. As soon as we have those various documents, we get you in the queue. And we will review those in the order in which they're received. And I think that's actually written here somewhere. Plans are reviewed in the order in which they're received, so again, earlier the better. What's nice, however, is that we, in October, we were running about 14 to 15 weeks for plan review. Regina saved us when we brought her on. We've got Ash and Regina now doing plan reviews almost full time. We've knocked that queue down to 5 weeks. So I'm pretty impressed with that. Our goal was 5 to 6 weeks, and we were there 3 months after we hired her and got her on. So the other advantage to that, or I think the other thing we have to take into consideration, is we were working at the end of the year. We typically don't get a lot of plan reviews coming in from mid-November through December, so it gave us some time to get caught up. Now the first of the year it's a new fiscal year for several people. We're starting to see numbers ramp up again, but I don't think we're going to see numbers above 8 to 9 weeks again. Certainly not 14 or 15. Yes, sir.
What's the email address?
FGIreview@state.co.us. So if you do all your correspondence through that email rather than to me directly, then it will be assured that somebody gets to it very quickly. Okay? So what happens is once we get it into the queue, we get to it as soon as we can in the next order. We'll begin the review process, and we basically create a spreadsheet with our list of questions. We'll look at your plans, we'll look at your functional program, we'll compare it to what's in this book. Any questions that we have, we'll put them in a spreadsheet with a reference number to the book as well in the book. And then we'll send that back to whoever that point of contact is, whether it's your architect, whether it's the facility administrator, whomever. And we'll work back and forth until we have no further questions. And then once we do that, we will issue you FGI approval. We'll make our clear staff, the certification and licensing branch, aware, because FGI approval and a certificate of compliance are mandatory before we can move forward with initial licensure. The COC, the certificate of compliance, comes from Fire Prevention and Control for life safety code or fire. Even if they don't do the review, even if it's done by those folks that we talked about earlier, maybe in Aurora, because it's a licensed only, they will still go through DFPC to issue us the certificate of compliance. Okay, once we have FGI approval, certificate of compliance, and you've completed all your other paperwork that our certification and licensing branch makes you do, that's when we can move forward with licensure. Okay?
Who does that go to the certificate of compliance at the CPH?
It comes to me.
Oh, okay.
Yep, because I'm that life safety code liaison.
I see.
So what happens is with a certificate of compliance, our certification and licensing team, gosh, there's like 4 or 5 of them up there. Sarah Kayat, is that name familiar to any of you? Sarah Kayat, she's one that deals with ALRs. She will send a request for a COC to me. I will forward it to DFPC. Everything goes through me. And then if they've got the plan review done, they've done inspections, they will issue back a COC. I'll save it in our files and forward it to Sarah so she knows about it. There are times we just get them from DFPC without being requested. It all depends on where your project hits in their queue as well. So once we have all of that, then we can move forward with licensure. Let's see. Yeah, so that's where we are. Waivers. Regulatory waivers are a thing, and we do quite regularly issue regulatory waivers for FGI-related questions. What I will tell you is that we tend to be much more favorable on waivers on existing facilities that are undergoing some renovations, things like that, because there are some pre-existing limitations to what you can do in that space. If you're building something from the ground up, we tend to not be as gracious with the waivers because, quite frankly, it's expected that it would have been designed right from in the first place. It's not out of the question, but we certainly are more forgiving with waivers on existing licensed facilities, or rather existing structures. The way that the waiver process works is you can apply for a waiver on our website. It's got the waiver application, it's online. It also has the instruction sheet. A couple things to be aware of. Number one, you're expected, if you're the facility applying for the waiver, you're expected to write the waiver. Don't make your architect do it, it'll get denied. Architects get handed that responsibility all the time. And I keep telling them, don't do it. We won't accept it. It has to come from the facility administration. It's their waiver, it's on their license, it's not an architect's responsibility. When you do a waiver, understand that there's going to be at least a 30-day delay because according to state statute and our rules, it is required to have a 30-day public notice posting on the property. We have up to 90 days to approve that. I can tell you that at least from the FGI side, it never takes that long. The only time I would envision something taking 90 days is if we did the public notice posting and for whatever reason we got people with picketing and boycotting at your place and ours. That may take a little longer than 30 days. But typically in the time that it takes for that 30-day public notice posting to come and go, we've already done the review. What happens is that once it's received, it goes to our associate division director, who's my direct supervisor, Kara Johnson Hufford. She will reach out to me or to Ash or whomever saying, what can you tell me about this waiver? And then she will make a recommendation to our division director, Randy Kirkendall, and he's the final say on it. That's how that works. And we can usually have that done within a day or two after that 30-day public notice posting has come and gone. We want to get you going as soon as we can, okay? The thing to bear in mind that is a little bit frustrating, but we have no way to deal with it, is this one right here. The term may not exceed 1 year. So that means if you have a waiver on your facility and you have no intention of ever changing it to come in compliance with whatever that issue is, you're going to have to submit a new waiver application every year. And the reason that is that the legislature wrote it to where the term of the waiver is conditional to the term of the license, and your license is only good for a year. Okay, so sorry, but if you have a waiver and you have to renew your license, you have to do one more piece of paper and renew your waiver. We'll approve it. It's not going to be a problem, but it is a step you'll have to take. So, and then there is, of course, the appeals rights that you have if you want to go down that route. I can't say that I have firsthand experience on that. I don't think we've had to go down that route since I've been here, at least not with FGI. These are some resources. Health facilities licensure and certification and registration. We won't spend much time on that now. Just know that this is on our webpage. We also have on our webpage the What is FGI, FGI FAQs that we're in the process of doing some upgrading and updating on as well. There's a copy of that FGI determination letter on the corridors, the public corridors on there. So we try to get as much information as we can onto our webpage so you can access that. But if you don't see it, then you call. I'm happy to answer your questions. Yeah, so there's that. Our reach philosophy, I won't spend a lot of time on that. Just know that we are here to serve you. One of the things that I like about our division director, this was his idea. When I came out of the fire service, my philosophy has always been, I was taught this from a mentor of mine years ago, an old fire chief, the only reason that government should exist is to serve the people. That's the only purpose for government, in my opinion. I'd like to say that all my higher-ups feel that way. I'm talking the way higher-ups. So there are limitations to what I can do about that, but that's my philosophy. I'm here to serve you guys. It's all about customer service. You are our customers, and we want to make this as painless as we can for you. If you have questions, give me a call, and please, if you hear of those rumors out there, or you know somebody who needs questions answered because they've heard the rumors, send them my way. I'll give them all the time in the world. That's what I'm there for. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, the City of Aurora just recently changed their regulations saying that you can only have now, if you're a new facility, you can only have 6 beds. Have you heard anything as to why?
No. Of course, we don't have any jurisdiction over the locals. We're running into a few issues. I'm trying to remember what the example was, but South Metro Fire has become quite huge. It started with Parker and a few other communities that joined together as a cost-saving effort, and it just continues to grow and grow. This last year, they absorbed Cunningham Fire Protection District over in Aurora. They've absorbed Littleton Fire. So South Metro is growing considerably as far as a fire district goes. One of the issues that South Metro is confronted with is their response area now encumbers 14 different communities or districts. And each one of those has their own rules and regulations as far as fire codes and building codes. It's quite a challenge for them. And I know we're running into some issues now, and I don't remember the details, and I'd hesitate to even mention it because I could be wrong. But certainly we're in some discussions right now with South Metro Fire over how to address those situations. And when it comes to Aurora, I'll tell you where we are running into issues we're working on right now is with fire prevention and control. Aurora and Denver Fire, for whatever reason, don't like signing the State Division of Fire Prevention and Control permits. They want to use their own permit, and I guess I understand that, but DFPC isn't set up to receive their documents. So as a result, we're at a bit of an impasse between who's going to sign at the local level the DFPC permit so they can issue us a certificate of compliance. We've had an ALR in Denver that's been held up for a while on their licensing because we can't get a certificate of compliance from DFPC because DFPC and Denver Fire are struggling to see whose piece of paper somebody's going to write a signature on. Going back to that bureaucratic stuff that absolutely drives me nuts, but it's out of my control, and I apologize for that. But yeah, when it comes to the locals,
Any assumptions?
no. No, I wish I could comment.
Do you think, in your personal opinion, 6 is silly for them to say it needs to go down to 6?
You're going to put me on the spot, aren't you?
Of course. I mean, your average house in Aurora, at least in the south area, has at least 5 bedrooms.
You know, I can only...
So if we're talking just 6 people, you're adding one more room and one more person. So
I
I'm
can
just
only
curious.
speak from our side of things, and I know that our licensing allows more than that. And obviously, I think if we feel that strongly about it, then I think we're supportive of that. I don't know what their rationale is for it, other than whether or not they're just quoting something out of a recently adopted fire code, I'm not sure, or building code. But I hesitate to comment. It's not an FGI issue, and therefore I'm certainly not going to be the expert in that.
Right.
But-
And what level of opinion could you write? Could you write an email that says, based on our rules, that we'd be okay?
No.
My partner's telling me to stop, but I'm not.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to make it stop. I mean,
Okay. You could stop me.
We don't have the jurisdiction to do that.
Sure. I'm just curious.
Now we could write a friendly letter, and they could friendly say, you know what you could do with your letter.
Sure.
But we don't have any jurisdiction or any say in it. So I doubt that my bosses would even consider writing such a letter because it's out of our authority.
Sure. Thank you.
But I appreciate where you tried to take me on that.
I thought you said you served the community here.
Yeah, no, and I understand. And like I said, I am, when I say that I hate bureaucracy with a passion, I do, which is kind of ironic considering my entire career has been in government.
Well, my comment would be, it's a fair housing litigation, so I'm contacting a lawyer, an attorney, regarding fair housing. That's what I would do.
Sure.
Because
I saw the microphone handed back there.
Is there any other differences between 15 and 16 beds besides the corridor?
Not right now. Like I said, I
Commercial
envision-
kitchen?
Well, the commercial kitchen, I think it's at somewhere around 20, if memory serves. FGI doesn't address the commercial kitchen. I know that's done through the through the licensing. So I'm not sure about that, but I think 20 comes to mind. Okay, that's fine.
So if you're purchasing a house, change of ownership, increase in beds, but no construction, you don't have to submit to FGI?
An existing house that's doing business, currently licensed, you're buying it, and then you're going to add beds. Am I saying that right?
Yes, but no construction.
Right, so what will happen is you'll end up doing not only a change of licensure, but a change of bed in your license application. And our certification and licensing branch will reach out and find out whether there is construction. And if there is, then yes, there will have to be an FGI review in the areas within the scope of that construction. If you're saying, for example, we're just using unused space, or maybe we're taking a room from single to double occupancy, as long as it meets the requirements within our rules, or the Chapter 7 rules, and there's no construction, then there's nothing FGI related to that.
I have a question. I don't know if you could answer it though, but I will put it forth anyway. Is there a threshold to percentage of ownership that would trigger a application for a change of ownership for licensure?
I am not your dude. Yeah. What I will do right now is I will tell you, Cheryl McMahon, who's the branch chief over Community and Home Services, gave me a stack of her business cards. The other one is a stack of my business cards. I'll leave these up here. Any of those programmatic or licensing questions, I would certainly encourage you to call her. I know just enough to get myself in trouble when it comes to those questions. I know the FGI, when it comes to ownership and licensing, I'm not the guy to give you advice. So I'll leave these business cards up here for both Cheryl and I, and please feel free to grab those. Okay.
That, it just changed. So the new regulation just went into effect like a week ago. And it's different, it's much different. We can talk about it after.
Very good. All right, well, we've gone about 20 minutes longer than I think I was supposed to, but hopefully we had a good conversation. I'll let you guys get on with your evening, but again, take my business card, take Cheryl's, and if you think of some other questions later on, please feel free to call me. Like I said, I am here for you. I want to make this as painless as possible, and we'll get through it together.
Marshall, would it